Now, ladies and gentlemen, today we're talking about whether we should criminalize the defamation. Now, the contextualization that we would like to actually set before we go on to the main arguments. We're living in a liberal democracy where the freedom of speech and our fundamental right to pursue or act out something that we would like to is really considered as the fundamental value, ladies and gentlemen. We say that this kind of freedom of speech is so important that we should actually not criminalize defamation and actually leave it upon to the public so that it can raise more benefits throughout the society. And also, even in the cases in which the freedom of speech crosses the line and causes the harms, we say that there are enough check and balance mechanisms to actually naturally filter them out. So we say that when we weigh the benefits and the harms of criminalizing the defamation, we say that the harms far outweigh. Therefore, the reason to not criminalize defamation. Now, what do we mean by defamation? We say that three types of speech or opinions towards any entities or even the government. We say that a good example that we would like to set is the criticism towards the government. Well, even if it is not 100% sure fact, some doubts or the skeptical questions that media can raise towards the government. For example, I think that there is a chance of embezzlement. I think that there could be possibilities of corruption. Those kind of opinion that media and the people raise to the government, those things could be considered as defamation, which is something that we would like to actually talk about. We say that defamation what could be considered as a defamation, but what is actually a free speech can actually cause a lot of benefit to the society. Now, having said that, let us go on to the main arguments. On the first argument, I'm going to lay out the fundamental principle of today's motion, the standards of criminalization. We say that in order to criminalize something, it has to be really, really heinous, right? And there has to be objective standards to measure the harms and the results of the acts that has been done. For example, like any types of crime that is actually being criminalized always have to some extent the quantifiable aspects. For example, in cases of murder and rape, like one occurrence and second occurrence and several occurrences, all those quantifiable differences are taken into the consideration of the heinousness, right? And also, if you actually intentionally hit someone by a car, the level of the tangible or the physical harm done to that people is actually taken seriously into the consideration of the amount of punishment you get. So we say that in order for you to criminalize something, there needs to be a quantifiable aspect that you can always actually, to some extent, measure by objective standards. However, why cannot defamation bring this objectivity? It's because defamation, although it kind of embraces some tangible aspects like reputation, harms economic income, we say that there are many cases, there are rather more important cases that deals with the mental damage on the reputation. For example, as in the Qijun case, like the reason why she committed suicide is not because she lost money because of her reputation being damaged. It's because of the serious trauma that the public has caused to her. So we say that these mental aspects are the focus of the defamation. Then we say that why this mental area cannot be included in the quantifiable aspects of the criminalization. It's because when it comes to the mentality, it's so subjective. Like the level of harm that an individual can receive, even though a same comment has been made, is different among individuals from individuals because they're all subjective. They have all different standards towards what is heinous, to what extent, and what is not heinous. So we say that because like every individual has different standards, subjectivity regarding the level of consequence that has been done, we say that we cannot really criminalize this whole act as a defamation according to an objective standard. Then why is this a harm? Why, without objective standard, why is this situation problematic? It's because we say that the criminal justice system has to be fair, right? But what can make it fair? The objective standards, ladies and gentlemen. We say that fairness comes when you get the same amount of punishment as the same criminal. For example, you do the same thing as he does the same thing as you. Then you receive the same punishment according to the same standards. That kind of objectivity is what brings the fairness to the justice system. However, like for example, there was a comment and I was hurt severely and she wasn't really severely hurt. And those two received different amounts of harm. We say that even though there was the same act, because the consequences and the punishment would be so different according to subjectivity, this would actually hinder the objectivity of criminalization. Now on the main argument, which is about the freedom of speech. We say that freedom of speech is really, really valuable in liberal democracies. Why is this so? It's because in the first aspect, it's a fundamental right. It's actually a precondition for you to pursue further happiness. Like for you, if you actually are able to speak out things that you think or you want, or even you require to the government freely, then we say that this would be a precondition that you can act out something further in the future towards the government or towards any entities that you want. But on the most important second level of analysis, why is freedom of speech really important? In the social level of importance, it's because it brings debates. It opens up the possibility of social discussion. We say that if in the case that I actually raised some skeptical questions towards the government, as in the case of PD Suchok, right? They didn't even have 100% sure facts about the mad cow diseases. However, they actually raised doubts about it. However, the government actually accused them of defamation. However, it wasn't really criminalized in the courts. This is because the courts actually decided that the act to free speech or to the right to act out freely as to raise the social debate and make it as an issue for us to think about it as well and lead to a better direction. The court believed that this was the very fundamental value in liberal democracies, where all the people get to participate and also raise their voices, ladies and gentlemen. So we say that the harm that could occur by this defamation is that people will be so afraid of the government and not even raise skeptical questions about the government, even if there is some doubtful situations. So we say that it hinders the social debate, as in the case of or any government issues. For these reasons, we believe that not only it does not fit into the standard of criminalization, but also because it hinders the core value of democracy, which is the freedom of speech, we are proud to propose.
Thank you, Prime Minister, for your speech. And now I would like to invite the leader of the opposition.
The reason why we are having this debate is that we have a growth of access to the internet, so that there are more people who can freely express their feelings, opinions about other things, about products and business and government, without any consideration whether their actions, their speeches would cause any damages. That's what's happening in the State's Quo, and that is what the Prime Minister failed to realize. And what in her characterization, it feels like this war is suppressing people. It feels like people feel threatened by any possibility that you might be sued by the government so that you cannot speak freely. I don't think that's happening in the State's Quo, and I don't think that is what actually happening here. And the problem we are addressing is actually the opposite. We're trying to fight this too free environment, so that people would really own up to what they say. They would really see consequences before they make public speeches. Because of this era of self-media and everyone is like, because internet, So you have this power as much as CNN has. It has any power. As long as you grow enough followers, as long as you have like your own way of marketing and that kind of stuff. So for any person in this world, there's a high chance that you would have a quantifiable effect when you speak things. You don't know whether the thing that you say would be like viral video or the thing that you would say would be reposted by other people. So in many cases, as long as the nature of the thing that you said is a defamation of other things, you can't really say that this, because it's small, because it doesn't spread that much, it's not defamation, and it's right inherently. And also, it's kind of contradictory for the Prime Minister to say that she would like to welcome debate while she's actually eliminating a form of debate, which is by the government prosecuting people who might have committed a crime of defamation. It's actually opening a debate in a public way, and also for the prosecution to find out what really happened and what is the truth. No, not this time. Also, she mentioned things like if there is subjectivity in whether this is a defamation at all, which is why we want the prosecution to find out whether it is or not. So that's the burden of the prosecution. There shouldn't be any worry about that. No, not this time. So we are saying, and she also points out that there are some standards whether this is crime at all, which would be very good for me to build on to say whether, to really tell about whether this is a crime in principle level. What we see is that there are things you can sue, like there are civil cases you can bring yourself, you can sue the people who harm you. But when the damage is done to a certain level, when you yourself cannot sue back, like in the cases of murder, so the victims cannot do anything, so the government should step in at their role to help them to find the justice. And also in the cases when the effect or the influence is so huge that on a social level, the government would want to step in and to tell the society that this is the wrong thing to do. And this is what's happening in all the cases of defamation. If there is a mind element, a mental element that people deliberately know that there is something false in their information and they actually spread out in any way, then there is the two elements that we want in a crime. Also, when they are saying something bad about a person, a business, or a country, as long as there is damage done to their reputation, there is damage done to the people that the government should be responsible for protection.
On that note.
Not this time. Which is why we say, especially when it's the case of some bad things said about government or about the nation or about an international service, international business, this is going to be not only about the two parties, it is also going to be the benefits of the people inside the country, which is why we think and we strongly assert that the government's role in this case is still there. They should take in the role and the position to prosecute and to do what's right. What's right? What's your point?
I think when it comes to judging a person's criminality, you need to have uniformity in prosecution. In other words, if someone does wrong in this kind of place, you should also prosecute other people who commit the same crime. Guarantee us that you can actually stop every single defamation that is happening unless you lose legitimacy in uniformity.
I don't think what's happening in the status quo is that the government is actually able to prosecute every crime happening in the world. I mean, when you find a murderer, then you prosecute a murderer, and also there are other murders happening in the world, but I don't think the government, or it's the burden for the government to say that if he cannot prosecute every possible crime, then the government is not doing its job. So, what are the benefits of our of the current situation of making defamation a crime? We would see that there will be deterrence. That's going to be a good thing because we're making the citizens, we're sending the message that people should be responsible to their messages. With that well said, I think the second good benefit about our policy is that the government is going to like for the rich people or for the rich parties, they are well in their place to prosecute, or no, to sue the other party that might have said something bad about them. But for the vulnerable parties, for me, for example, if someone said I'm a hooker on the internet, now I can call the police and the government is going to set the case and they are going to investigate according to IP address and everything else. So as for the vulnerable parties, the government is doing a better job in protecting those people, and also with the deterrence benefits aside. Because the government has the better resources and it has the role to do this, it's going to be better for the party who are disadvantaged in suing a civil courts, for example. So the second benefit, apart from deterrence and helping the vulnerable parties, is that there will be truth coming out, which will be well elaborated by my partner. So for all those reasons, we are strongly opposing this motion.
The speaker spoke for 7 minutes and 14 seconds.
All right, I thank the leader of the opposition for her speech, and now I would like to invite the Deputy Prime Minister.
Mr. Chair, from what I've heard from the opening of the show, to me, the idea kind of sounded like that the public should always tell something based on facts. Why is it a fact that should be always out in the society? Why not suspicions? Why not ideas and thoughts about certain persons? Why not neglect? Why are we allowing discriminations? We believe that there is a reason as to why these sort of things should be allowed within the society. And we believe when we criminalize these kind of defamations, we believe that there's going to be more harm in the end of the day. First of all, I want to rebut to their cases why, as an opening government, we believe that a unilateral idea and unilateral decisions in criminal court matters to the public satisfactions of criminal justice. First of all, we believe that publics get most happy, most satisfied when they see a consistency within the judicial court, right? I think that's the start when publics seem to take the idea that, you know what, a court system that exists for us, a fair court. I think that's why we need to take considerations that, hey, as a government, we don't believe that it is hard to create a unilateral and a very continual court justifications when we are dealing with these sort of crime, because it will always differ from time to time. And also because it's hard to measure the collateral damage that are being done to each individual when I say something bad about these individuals. I think that's the reason as to why we cannot criminalize it to begin with. Secondly, as a proposition, we believe that there is a room that the publics are able to choose what they want to hear and what they not want to hear. We believe that these kind of deformations create social discussions within some entities. Before I move on, let's look at some of the characteristics as to how and when these forms of deformations happen, right? Some entities are getting blamed based on facts or based on suspicion, right? I think these kind of reports on certain society, when we look at the society, we saw officials being blamed for the things that they've done in the past. I think this sort of discussion creates our public to get more interest into certain subjects like government officials or other individuals. But we say that these sort of discussions create more benefit because we believe that ideas and suspicions should also be included because we believe these kind of social discussions create more ideas as to what these people do. But before I move on, is there any pure?
Yes, sir.
Yes.
Under status quo, in a trial you must actually prove the person intended harm and then that the statement is false. So if you're talking about just some question or rumor, actually the prosecution has to prove that that person was actively wrong in order to have any punishment. How does that restrict speech?
No, I think we say it doesn't necessarily has to be a fact. A fact could be incorrect, but we're going to allow it because we believe that the whole principle of what we call these two people's they're more likely to report, they're more likely to tell their ideas about certain people or certain celebrities or certain individual or even the government. I think because we're practically criminalizing what we call defamation, I think it neglects the idea of people to say things based on not really a truth, but maybe. But I think this is the case that really matters, because it might be true, but the fear of being criminalized hinders these individuals to report, hinders the individuals' motivations to say what they think about certain critics. I think we can see what defamation from time to time as a form of discussion, as a form of criticism as also. And I think in those manners we create benefit because we allow social individuals to actually participate, because they're not, in the end, not feeling afraid to say things because they knew the fact that they won't be criminalized in the end of the day. Mr. Speaker, I think OG has told you as to how that there needs to be a unique, clear standard when it comes to court criminal justice. I think what opposition has to put to me that whether there exists a tangible harm, because according to the first speaker, I wasn't able to see how these kind of notions or these kind of defamations are creating active harms amongst these people. I don't think that this is an issue that could be quantified. I don't see how this is an issue that could be seen in a very clear light, not objective. And I want to hear from Peter, according to how these kind of speeches or these kind of these actions will create so much tangible harm that enough for us to persecute to begin with. Let's see. So I think also when we look at the society, when we look at defamation, we believe that there are times that publics are capable of choosing and understanding whether these things are facts or not. I think that public is not really stupid to see whether these facts that are being printed out is actually true. Because we're seeing cases like PD Stop, we're seeing cases like, perhaps Dubey, right? We say that these kind of notions, these kind of discriminatory acts are sometimes, as the pictures on media and internet-based scripts or writings, we believe that the publics are sort of capable of not going for these ideas. Because when the time to time these acts, when they're bit extreme, we believe that the public doesn't necessarily gain great intentions from these issues. We don't believe that from time to time that it's not really the public from time to time will be capable of thinking through, and we believe that openness, that the idea of public to think based on these rumors, based on these suspicions, based on this harassment, the idea that these things are open to the public is a very fundamental idea about the opening government beliefs. Because it's open for us to comprehend, because we are open, because we are capable of understanding, because the public is capable of seeing these things in the public, we believe that it creates people to think about these matters, and and also motivate people to find out whether these things that they have said were factually true or not. I think this kind of leads to more social discussions, and through the end of the day, we believe we are very practical.
Right, thank you, Deputy Prime Minister, for your speech, and now let's hear from the Deputy Leader of the Opposition.
Our stance is that there is a government responsibility to prosecute defamation as a criminal trial because there is public harm. And whenever that occurs, government is always responsible to take action, as the Leader of Opposition said. I'm going to talk about three things in my speeches. First, about the nature of defamation trials and how that rebuts their freedom of speech argument. Second, about the principle of what is a crime and how that rebuts their idea that there is no harm and no problem in status quo. Third, about practical benefits of having the government add on official prosecution of a criminal trial to any possible defamation lawsuit that may be gained individually, which will also rebut their point about how different individuals may be harmed to different extents. Okay, so first, nature of criminal trial. As I said, or nature of defamation trial, rather. As I said in my point of information, a defamation trial has two standards for finding someone guilty of defamation. One of those standards is whether the idea is false or not. Now we agree there may be some gray area cases, as they said, where what somebody puts on the internet may be potentially damaging, but it's hard to decide whether it's exactly true or false. If you say, like, my Apple iPhone exploded in my hand, they're dangerous, okay, part of that might be true. Maybe your Apple iPhone did explode in your hand. Maybe you were doing something stupid with it at the same time, so it was dangerous, right? So there are gray areas. We concede that. However, there's a second standard which is really important. There has to be an intent to harm and an intent to give the falsehood. And because that standard exists, the government or the person suing in a private suit, either way, has to actually prove to the judges in Korea or the jury in the US or wherever that that person intended to harm and intended to give a false statement. Now that's pretty hard to do. So actually there's very little suppression of free speech under that model. And as we see in status quo, as the leader of opposition so well explained, the real problem is not that government is using defamation lawsuits to suppress free speech. Yes, once or twice, maybe some public figure will threaten, like, I'll sue you, but that usually doesn't work. There's tons of negative postings on the internet about all kinds of people, every politician who's ever run for office, every corporate head. There's like a lot of negative stuff out there. So we don't see their harm at all. Instead, we see my second point, what is a crime, and why in particular does the government have a responsibility to prosecute here? Well, the standard of a crime is not, as they say, what is heinous or what is not. Like, if I steal a bicycle, that may not be heinous, but that's still a crime. Why is it a crime? Because it doesn't just harm the person whose bicycle was stolen, it harms the public. It creates an atmosphere of lawlessness. It creates a situation where people feel unsafe, not only the person whose bicycle was stolen, but anyone in the area. It creates an incentive for further crimes for me. The government actually has a duty to interfere in cases like that. After I take this POI, I'll go on to explain why that applies to cases of defamation as well. Yes,
so in the cases of theft, it is actually very quantifiable on what subject, on which product you actually steal. So you say that lives up to our standard of quantifiable.
Yes, and after we have a defamation trial and the person was found to be, yes, A, malicious and intentional, and B, spreading a falsehood, then we also have a clear standard of whether this was defamation or not, and whether we can prosecute or not. So we see no problem there. So, why do lies and false rumors harm people? Well, let's look at the example of the Apple iPhone again, right? Now, if I say my iPhone exploded and I think they're dangerous, probably I would win any lawsuit Apple had against me, because that's like a personal statement and I'm not trying to defame them. If I said, like, scientific research has shown Apple iPhones will explode under these circumstances, like, and I make a bunch of false home pages with links and things and try to really defame them, then I will lose the lawsuit. But this is a public harm. Before I've even sued, right, a lot of people will be put off from iPhones, they'll have false information which will influence the kinds of products and choices they make. Like, that's a clear harm. Another case, if someone spreads a false rumor about a politician, like 5 days before an election, right? There's a public harm going on there, and the government has a duty, right, not to have people like change their votes and to deter the people who might be likely to spread these kinds of rumors. So yes, the politician could sue. Yes, Apple could sue. But the problem is, a lot of times these companies or these people they settle out of court. It's easier for them to spend like 10 million won or something to say just like take everything off the internet than it is to go through a whole long trial process and try and sue and so on. And while they're in the trial process, they don't want the false rumor to keep spreading around and so on, so they just settle, right? But the government has an interest in truth. As I said, lies and false rumors themselves are harmful to the public, not just to the person defamed. Therefore, the government has an interest in taking a hand, and if there is defamation, they should prosecute as the government to make sure that the truth comes out in a public forum, that there's no out-of-court settlement in the meantime, that the trial, no thank you, is taken to its full extent, and then there's a public record of what is true and what is false. And yes, it doesn't totally eliminate any harm, but to a large extent it will correct and remedy those harms. So we think that in itself is sort of a practical benefit. But on my third point, what's the additional practical benefit? Why is it that the government actually has to add on to private lawsuits? Well, we think there are several. First, maybe closing opposition was planning to bring this up, but sometimes it's true that corporations will use threats of suits to try to intimidate people. Or politicians will use threats of suits to try to intimidate people. And the problem is, in a civil trial, you have a corporation with huge legal resources threatening like one small small individual who doesn't have those resources. Here is a clear comparative advantage of a public trial, where you have public prosecutors, public defenders, more or less equal resources. Okay, we're not going to claim that the prosecutors don't have a bit of an advantage. We still think it's an improvement in terms of finding the truth, which is our final goal. Second, what about the deterrent factor? Okay, I might lose a lawsuit, I might have to pay somebody something, maybe they'll sue, maybe they won't, maybe I'll actually have extra benefit from defaming them if they settle out of court to try and make me just shut up, right? We see conflicting incentives on the people who are likely to defame and likely to post false rumors. They may do it for their own benefit. But in a government prosecution, there is absolutely no incentive to keep lying. Like, the more you lie, the longer your jail term. 5 years isn't much under status quo, but we think that's a bigger deterrent than like a 50-50 chance of being rewarded by Apple for shutting up about how bad their products are versus a chance of possibly having to pay them money. And like, if I don't even have the money to pay them, I don't have to pay them anyway. So we think government trials are better. We think that in cases where there's a public harm, we need to have a criminal trial, and we're proud to have it.
Then Mike.
Yeah.
Yeah.
You're going to I need to slow Mr. Speaker, opening spent 30 minutes talking about whether or not defaming people are useful for the society, bad for the society. Let's finally talk about whether or not we should define it in the boundaries of criminality. Provide you recharacterizations of what actually reputation is and why it doesn't have legal grounds for people to be judged whether or not they're guilty or not guilty by committing defamation. Before that, a couple of responses towards opening opposition. Basically, Peter and the leader of opposition spent a lot of time talking about deterrence. 3 responses towards deterrence in the first place. Firstly, they had the burden to prove why deterrence is actually going to work or even is working in the status quo. Because if the purpose is to generally make people not talk about bad things to each other, we think it's practically impossible for the court to do that, especially the court to do that, because we think that simply locking up people in jail doesn't necessarily limit the harms, the scope of the harms. We think human nature is to actually talk about things, and during that conversation, you don't know when or how you're going to hurt that person, because obviously people don't understand each other to the full extent. That's why we can never deter the mutual understanding of each other. So we don't think that perfectly we're going to achieve deterrence at the end of the day. The reason why this is also flawed is because once you actually claim, sue for defamation, you're also you're also committing defamation at the same time. In other words, if you actually sue a person for committing defamation, in other words, you're also defaming the other person's reputation at the same time. We think that in principle it is all arbitrary because you're trying to stop people from accusing each other for what's not true, but once you don't know what's absolutely true and objectively true, the burden of proof is on both sides of the house to prove each other being guilty. In other words, it's defamation by definition. That's why we tell you it's not even deterrence in the very first place. Thirdly, we think that they say that people are not going to lie in courts because, well, they're going to go into jail if the more they lie. We think that that's the exact reason why people have more incentives to lie in the very first place. Why? If they lie their teeth off and they don't get caught, they don't go to jail. We think that, especially if you put it in the context of the criminal court, people have more incentives to lie and more incentives to not disclose the truth at the end of the day. Because so at the end of the day, if you put it in the hands of the court, actually people are not going to find the truth, or actually people are not going to find methods to compensate for the harms anyways. And then they talked about crime is also about public harm. We think that the harm in itself is non-existent. Why is this so? The reason why there's a social dissatisfaction or social instability is because of this. People are afraid that they're going to be also victimized. Exactly if you use the bike example, people are afraid that their bikes are going to get robbed as well if you don't catch this person. We're going to tell you that everyone is already exposed to the harms of defamation in the status quo, with or without law. We don't think that even law stops that in the very first place. So if your purpose is actually to comfort the people in public, you're not going to do that at the end of the day. If you're failing in your objective anyways, we don't think that it deserves to be defined in criminal justice anyways. And then they say we're going to empower people because we're going to give you state attorneys and prosecution is going to do a good job. We think if there's a problem of a civil court, fix the imbalance and the asymmetry that lies within court, rather than simply just shifting all the burden into the criminal court. Let's go on to our extensions that are going to recharacterize this debate. We think we're first talking about reputation. When it comes to you suing someone, or even when it comes to you being judged as a criminal, there needs to be a first-hand experience of harm. In other words, it needs to be an asset or it needs to be a commodity that you innately own. In other words, we don't think that reputation is something that is built and given to you. In other words, it's a social concept that people give to you rather than your body or rather than your psyche. That's the reason why we punish murder as a crime or rape as a crime, because there's a first-hand, like your body is being harmed, which is body is your asset. In other words, someone else is trying to take away your asset. Same for a bike. You purchase the bike, someone takes away your assets. That's why you can actually claim for criminality. When it comes to reputation, Mr. Speaker, we don't think that people innately have a thing called a reputation. In other words, with the absence of people around you, there is no such asset called reputation. Thus, there is no first-party harm for us to even judge each other anyways. That's why when we establish the boundaries of crime, there needs to be a clear harm, in other words, how the perpetrator harms a victim. When the harm that the victim received isn't necessarily a harm that he innately had, rather it's something about people are going to think about me in a different way, we don't think that that's necessarily grounds for us to actually claim for defamation, thus being criminal, a criminal act. Anyways, but secondly, thank you. We think that the purpose of us having legal and illegal standards is to actually set moral standards and behavioral guidelines for people to abide by. In other words, the constitution of law is dependent on each social context. It's also dependent on each country's value system at the end of the day. We think that this moral system or this behavioral boundary can never confine defamation, include defamation. Why is this so? Because there isn't a socially agreed idea of what reputation is, Mr. Speaker. In other words, for example, you kill someone, you harm their body, it's bad, it's objective and universally applicable for everyone in the society, whether or not you're a woman, whether or not you're a man, whether or not you're old or young or not. When it comes to reputation, Mr. Speaker, the society has very different ideas of what is a reputation. For example, some kid might have a reputation in, spitting really far. Do you think, not making that kid spit is actually defamation, Mr. Speaker? This is the reason why your reputation cannot be objectively, not necessarily just about the damage and the quantity that are going to mention. I'll take it in a minute. But actually, we think that this reputation has to be something that the court can identify as a universal, acceptable value that they want to promote, which in this case is not. Yes.
Okay, so then if you think defamation is not such a harm, would you also ban civil lawsuits against defamation?
Okay, first let's have that debate in a different chamber. We don't think that the degree of criminality should be judged in a civil court. We think that we're only talking about in the context of a criminal court. Thus, there is no grounds for you to be prosecuted if you actually defame others. Let's have a different, the mental damage and whatnot. We can actually, say that in a different place in a civil court. But in a criminal court, it's absolutely whether or not it's true or false, whether or not you're guilty or not guilty, which cannot be judged by the grounds that we provide to you, since there is no social agreed concept. In other words, the reason why rape, the sentences differ by country and context is because some cultures actually value a very conservative value. That's why they have a higher higher sentence for rapes. On the other hand, some countries have a very low, punishment for rape. It's because people in general have a different idea of to what degree this person is to be punished. In other words, they deem sexuality to be something valuable or not. But in this case, reputation is something that we cannot objectively identify and agree to. Lastly, we told you in a POI that uniformity of prosecution is also important. In other words, if you're trying to penalize someone for doing something bad, anyone else who equally does that kind of thing should also be subject to criminalization. But in the status quo, if you say something bad to your friend in a playground, apparently it's not even under the boundaries of criminalization. The prosecution has no will to actually identify who is the perpetrator in this case. We think that it lacks uniformity because obviously there is no objective ground for us to even verify it in the very first place. Mr. Speaker, murder is universally bad. Rape is universally bad. Reputation, it depends on situations we're proud to propose.
Speaker for 7 minutes and 35 seconds. All right, I thank the member of government for his speech, and now I would like to invite the member of the opposition.
Mr. Speaker, I'm going to do two things in today's debate. Break the deadlock that was in the opening, which I had a heated debate about it's objective or subjective or not. I'm going to also engage the opposing government's argumentations with the try to pursue as a reputation as something very intangible. But I'm going to prove to you that also in my reputations, how it's very much tangible. It has physical harms to these people, also like non-physical, intangible harms to people, and that's why it's very much influential, and we need to protect these kinds of reputations for the people. So first of all, I'd like to engage the closing government's argumentation. First of all, Minyoung said that, we're not going to have, deterrence doesn't happen. First of all, maybe opening opposition didn't necessarily explain how this happened. Let me tell you how. First of all, you remove that member from society from reoccurring crimes from happening again, so that we teach them a lesson that you're not going to be able to do it because they don't have any physical freedom to do so. Second of all, it stops others from doing it too, because I see that person doing a similar action as I do. I'm going to also follow the same similar law, actually also going to be punished. Therefore, me going to jail is a significant harm to me, and therefore it deters me from also doing the similar actions as well. No, thank you. And also, Minyoung said, also defamation when you sue. What? Okay, I'm sorry. So we think that when he questioned the criteria of defamation, it's not necessarily. It's not necessarily tangible. We think that the intentions exist, and therefore these are the criteria. When specific intentions to that is to harm a specific person or a specific entity, we think that it's non-arbitrary enough to punish. Now to his extensions. First of all, he says that reputation is not a first-hand experience. This directly clashes with my extension, extensions. But I'm going to tell you how social connection, just to briefly say, the social connections are very tangible. It actually gives you a lot of things. It's a personal asset as well. Second reputations. We think that Minyoung said also that actually law as a behavioral guideline being including defamation is bad because it's very arbitrary. But we say that when people bash on you, use your reputation, when people bash on you, you get this kind of mental damage that is very much tangible. When actually, when you lose when you lose trust from other people, when you lose personal connections, when that person doesn't contact you anymore, then that's a significant loss on your personal assets as well. Third of all, we think that it's Yeah, that's pretty much it. So we think that when you actually you get bashed, we actually get defamed, we actually get a significant harm, we think that it's not arbitrary at all. Before we move on, yes?
Defamation is not harming a person's asset. It's just merely challenging people's perception and ideas that they have towards you. Thus, you cannot be a victim of that crime.
One more time. Quickly.
It's not a crime because no one harmed you, but rather it's challenging how other people believe in you and trust you. Thus,
it's my loss because other people view me, and I value other people viewing myself. I value my reputation. I value how other people know me. That's why we try to have a reputation in the big society, right? I want to I get the reputation of other people. That's how I get your reputation. That's how I get the reputation to also the adjudicators. Please, you should know this. And then lastly in my speech, I'm going to prove to you in my extensions the concept of law. Finally, what I actually talked about actually fits in the criteria of criminal justice. I'm going to do this in 3 levels. Directly diving in. First of all, we think that law and criminal justice exists to uphold the values that society share. What closing government tried to do in today's debate is try to depict that it's personal connection and this kind of reputation is not an asset. But we think that we already proved to you how it is very much an asset. And when the government when the government doesn't necessarily protect the people's interests, we think it's an unjust law. We need to fit it under the criteria of criminal law, actually punish it on a very fair basis. We think that because it's between commonwealth and who, in criminal law, it's usually how they introduce the cases is commonwealth versus who. It's just because we know that it's a common thing that we all share. We want to protect these kinds of common values for the other people, and that's why we need to uphold it as a law. Anyway, I'm going to tell. Also, we think that it's very much tangible because these social connections also give you tangible assets as well. We have concepts of kasan, right? You have connections, personal connections, to a prospect, corporation or whatnot, then that person puts you in a prestigious position or whatnot. We think that these kind of connections are very much valuable. Actually, can exchange an intangible asset to a tangible asset. We think that these kinds of connections are very much valuable. I prioritize my friends. Maybe you don't. Mr. Speaker, we think that actually it creates a dichotomy of a law and people's existence. People's beliefs. How is this so? This is an engagement also to the uniformity argumentation, how law should be also be objective to also the opening government as well. We think that the people's concept that justice is very much important because it actually creates a standard of acting upon it. It creates guidelines to practice your freedom. Because we value different, it actually influences how different people value and act upon, value different acts and phenomena. So we think that law is a depiction of this. But why should it be subjective? Because law is very much different in every case. It goes case by case. Law is a social construct, and actually it exists in order to actually protect the social tranquility, the social sentiment as a public sentiment as well. That's why we have the jury system. That's why we actually that's why we they handle cases differently. Although it may be still murder, we might think that if it was the cause to protect yourself or protect somebody else, then we actually justify that differently. So we think that this kind of uniformity doesn't necessarily exist at all. We think that it should be more about fairness and subjective in people's sentiments also, because it satisfies and actually increases social utility also. So when this doesn't happen, when the dichotomy of this law and people's beliefs is different, now law loses its legitimacy. Now people will now question the government and have more mistrust of the government. Will actually now think that the law is not necessarily something that is actually just because it goes against my beliefs. My government's not representing me as efficiently and accordingly proportionally as possible. When I think it's actually the majority's beliefs that I prioritize my personal asset, my personal relationship. When we think that actually is social construct, we think that law should uphold its bargain its end of the bargain, and that's why we should advance to the finals. Thank you.
No. Speakers spoke for 7 minutes and 19 seconds.
What was the second? What is the time? See, the problem is not whether it's tangible or intangible, because that is you can't judge with the standard. See, I was talking to valuable to everyone because you know you can sell it for some amount of money. The thing is, if you sell my reputation, maybe my reputation is important to me. Maybe your reputation is important to you. Right?
Alright, thank you very much for the opposition for your speech, and now let's invite the last speaker to come present. Just a little bit. One more leg. Yeah. It seems like it was
I'll race through my speech, don't worry.
It's still going to take some notes.
Our stance is not whether it's tangible or intangible. The problem is that the standards are not tangible. Maybe my reputation is important to me. Maybe Minyoung's reputation is not important to him. We don't think that standard of arbitrary standard is allowed in the legal system. We don't think it's a matter of whether you can quantify the certain reputation, but the fact that you can't quantify the standards itself is the problem. Maybe because I'm raped, I'm going to have some psychological and physical damage, right? Which is some sort of a standard because everyone has it. Because when you get raped, obviously you are going to get harmed because it's a first party harm. The problem with reputation is because, as Minyoung told you, it's so subjective to a person's needs on how important I consider social construct to be, which is the problem that you can't simply persecute people on the basis of one person thinking reputation is the world to him while the other person thinks that reputation is nothing to him. A few points of engagement, but before that, CO, where were your extensions, right? First class is about what is crime. Second one is defamation inherited. First of all, when you talk about what is crime, when O came up and talked about, firstly, because since damages
are present, since the victim cannot do anything, therefore we should allow prosecution. And secondly, because social impact is too large. First of all, when you talk about since victims can't do anything, it's a simple assertion. But secondly, you can't really have standards of prosecution in itself. It's not a matter of solvency, but the fact that you can't even put it up to court decision because you don't have standards to judge on now. But secondly, when they talk about social impact is too large, 2 points of... No, you never told my POI. 2 points, right? Firstly, social impact varies when the question of reputation is there. Maybe social impact is massive when you're talking about maybe like Samsung's like CEO's reputation. When you're talking about my reputation, maybe social impact is not going to be that large, right? How exactly do you classify social like impact then? Secondly, like look at social impact when the government has a standard to pursue a social value actively. That's when you start condemning something that's against it as a crime. When you know that a social value has standing, right? But I'm going to tell you why reputation isn't really a social value in itself, why it's not reputation, but the fact that people should not lie, which is not the same thing as reputation, right? But then they talk about, you know, how malicious intent itself justifies persecution because it's damage to reputation. First of all, why is malicious intent the justification? Because in status quo, maybe you don't have the malicious intent, but like manslaughter, maybe you were just standing by there, you were a victim to the process as well. We don't think malicious intent itself should always justify the prosecution. But secondly, what is the extent of the damage, right? Because in cases of rape, what we see is like there is physical as well as psychological, like first party harm, right? Because it's to me, but reputation isn't a single actor that's acting upon that particular factor. Because reputation is literally what everyone over here thinks about me, right? So who exactly is going to be held accountable to this? Because this isn't even first party harm, not second party harm, not third party harm, but multiple party harms because you cannot measure the standard, right? Moreover, they talk about, you know, it's because it's a benefit of the people, so it's a government role. We think no, government as well as the justice's role is not to pass arbitrary standards, right? And they talk about public harm is present and the entire deterrence question. Now, first of all, deterrence, you talk about social harm when you don't want like people to like pursue a particular social harm. In this case, social harm being that people should not lie about your reputation. But why do people lie in the first case? Then prove to us how, if you have these prosecutions in these court, how it's going to deter people from lying about you anywhere else. We don't think that's the case by simply putting people in jail because it hasn't been happening to whistleblowers. It hasn't been happening to like what the opening entire contention about like freedom of speech. It hasn't been happening even in those official stances. We don't think like simply putting people in jail and prosecuting them because maybe that person lied about me somehow like deters other people lying about me, right? Because when you see why people actually lies, it's because that person's reputation is exactly that to me, or maybe I consider that person to be that thing, or maybe I have a malicious intent against that person, right? We don't think that in case like deters other people from lying about the same thing again, that is your burden to prove, right? If you're trying to criminalize it. Next, the CEO comes up with like this vague extension that, you know, psychological harm is tangible. Again, tangible versus intangibility is not the issue here when you cannot even prosecute the issue itself because you have no standards on which to judge how much of an impact this causes to each people. We think it's very unfair when you allow this prosecution, so I get a larger amount of maybe like punitive damages done, maybe I get a huge sum of compensation because it means a lot to me, while Minyoung gets the same sum of compensation, but he doesn't really care about his reputation, right? But second clash is defamation inheritance. Because the entire deterrence effect, you need to prove to us why criminalization is imperative to upholding the morality that we should not lie. We don't think you needing to criminalize like defamation itself is the only way to prove in the status quo that defamation is a wrong thing to do. Why is that? Because we think social condemnation itself works as a mechanism. Why is that? Because firstly, people are social creatures that are capable of empathy and sympathy. We think that exactly is the criteria of social condemnation. The fact that you feel sympathy over a particular person actually like being condemned in court, right? But secondly, we think it also like creates a sort of an environment of understanding that actually presses forward this moral dialogue. But even if you're going to come up and tell us, no, humans are like bad creatures, we're all against each other, we think that itself also fuels our point. When we talk about social condemnation works as an alternative, when you don't really want to like put yourself in that position for other people to condemn you by you condemning other people, right? So we think social condemnation works as a perfectly fine way in order to say that lying is bad, defamation is bad. You don't necessarily need to criminalize it to do it because we don't think criminalization criminalization is always going to be the actor that deters this, right? Because, as I already told you, it's not perfectly going to deter it. That's your burden to prove, right? But secondly, they talk about how, from the opening, that you have an interest in truth, and then they talk about this entire intimidation factor that public forums or outside settlements. First of all, both function under rule of law. If you have a problem with it, you have a problem with the law. Secondly, why is private settlements bad? Because one, you have laws against intimidation, right? Secondly, we think intimidation even happens in courts when you have fancy lawyers against you. That's still intimidation, right? Because that's as subjective as what reputation is, like Minyoung told you. But thirdly, if that's a problem, it's not a problem of defamation, it's a problem of your court itself. But then they talk about like social connections and tangible benefits, right? First of all, as I told you, they're not tangible benefits to everyone. Then prove to us that reputation itself is inherently valuable to everyone. They talk about dichotomy of law and how it exists to protect social sentiment. Then prove to me how my reputation is always going to be sold, and that's always going to be this massive social harm, right? Because we think a child in kindergarten who's accused falsely of taking someone else's Crayola, therefore her reputation is bad, isn't going to have much of a social impact on our economy, right? And then they talk about government legitimacy for my personal asset. We think there's something different between private property versus a particular reputation, because private property remains uniform under law, right? But basically what we told you is, first of all, state has an inherent value to defend and prosecute. That's when you criminalize things, because firstly, the value should be uniformly judged. Secondly, the value must be socially consented, because one, principles of law, universality, which is what Minyoung talked about, but secondly, customary law, right? It's only when you have social consent that you actually have law derived from it. You don't have the battle in the legal background of whether or not you do it, which is the entire debate about abortion, pro-life or pro-choice, right? Because you first consent to the morality before bringing it up onto legal grounds. But secondly, we also gave you that one side needs to win in a particular legal definition. But in this case, we think both sides lose, the accuser as well as the accused. Therefore, we're very proud to defend. Yes.
Alright, thank you, Government Whip, for her speech. Now let's invite the last speaker in the opposition wing.
Get up.
It's only 6,
Oh my god, it's 6.
So the only constructive argument, the feedback that came from Abby's case was that the standard for judging defamation is always subjective, and because it does not apply to everyone, we shouldn't just prosecute it at all, even if there are victims who get damaged, even if there are people who actually lose social supports that are actually incentive, and there are also sometimes motives to elongate their life, Mr. Speaker. However, in my speech, firstly, Mr. Speaker, I'm going to tell you about my clash. I'm going to tell you how defamation actually fits into the criteria of criminal law system, and then secondly, I'm going to touch upon the idea of freedom of speech and engage both on opening government and the closing government, touch upon the facts that the opening didn't touch upon. Firstly, about whether defamation touches upon the criteria of criminal legal system or not. So the government actually had three reasons. Firstly, because the harm done by defamation is immeasurable and is subjective, and about how law must be always objective and consistent, and secondly, about the Minyoung and Abby's talk about how reputation isn't a social value, and about how there is an objective standard of actually judging whether the damage of reputation, damage of reputation is being done. But firstly, Mr. Speaker, we think even though you cannot mathematically and objectively calculate the exact harm that was done by a defamation process, we think you can actually can measure the propensity and degree of the harm being done. Because me saying to Taeyong that you are stupid is actually different to me saying to the media by making false accusations about how Samsung is doing a bad job and how Samsung is actually going against the human rights, because that actually creates a huge damage on the brand image of Samsung itself, and people are going to be boycotting against Samsung. It brings huge damage upon Samsung, and a lot of people related to Samsung's actually assets. So, Mr. Speaker, we think the degree and propensity actually can be actually measured. But secondly, Mr. Speaker, even if it cannot be actually measured, and even if it's very subjective, we think that reputation is actually value that nation must be upholding, values that when once are actually degraded, and values that were once infringed upon, that when government actually take into the criminal court, such as the right to life, equality, fairness. Why is this? Because reputation is something that is built upon people's efforts, something that nation must always be prioritizing, something that the nation must be always putting emphasis on. Because we think for instance, you look at Jungmin or any other kind of good people that have good reputation, it's because they endeavored so much. They endeavored to contribute back to the society. They endeavored to study hard or to garner a lot of money. We think that self-reputation is actually product of effort, product of humanity, and we think that's something that the government must protect and hence take to the criminal court when it is infringed. But thirdly, Mr. Speaker, how there isn't any standard, and if there are actually no standard, we think just because my intention wasn't malicious, but even though my intention wasn't malicious, but the victim was hurt, just because of the perpetrator's interest, it shouldn't be taken to the court. That does not make sense, because what they are actually doing is they're even taking away the benefit of the doubt. Because we think when it comes to the law system, it must be always the victim-oriented policy. Why is this? Because the victim is the one who thought that his idea of justice was infringed upon by others. And in this kind of cases, Mr. Speaker, we think the government must take an active position and become a responsible government, and at least try to see whether this victim's idea of justice was really infringed or not. But that does actually create really big harm to the perpetrator. Because if my intention wasn't really malicious, when I was only telling the truth and criticizing him, that is going to be proof in the court. No criminal case for me. But secondly, if my intention was really hurtful and I actually lied to them and made accusations by talking about false facts, we think that itself actually proves that I have a malicious intent, and it actually proves, and hence we think the government is doing a good job of promoting justice to that victim, Mr. Speaker. But fourth level, Mr. Speaker, even if that standard is immeasurable and subjective, we think this is something that Abby never engaged upon, and it still stands as a debate of clear extension coming from the opposition side, which is about what law is supposed to be and how law can actually fulfill its role and its purpose. Mr. Speaker, what is law? We think law is actually eventually a social contract, something that was made for the people to actually fulfill the justice that they thought about, the concept of justice coming from the people. I.e., if people's concept of justice changes, we think that's why the law system also must be subjective and hence open to the ideas of the public and flexible and flexible. However, we think the law that they're actually talking about is a rigid law that is incapable of changing, that it's incapable of actually fulfilling the justice that the people are talking about. Because we think people are never objective. People sometimes tend to be emotional. People tend to be subjective and change their minds. Their concept of justice is going to be changing. But Mr. Speaker, it is already done in the status quo. We think legal system isn't always so objectifiable and isn't always consistent as they think so. Because we actually do measure some things that are unmeasurable. Because a man actually raping another child, a stranger child, is different from a man raping his own daughter. Why? Because it actually incorporates the emotions, incorporates the sensitivity, the sentiments that the public has. We like this law, Mr. Speaker. Why? Because it actually fulfills the justice that we sort of talking about. That's what we're happy about, and thank you. But secondly, Mr. Speaker, now my class is going to be about the freedom of speech.
Before I move on.
No, thank you. Yes.
Okay, firstly, We already told you that social consensus is reached before law. Prove to us how flexible law is any better, because we think having objective standards is a much more better way of judging people rather than law that's left up to interpretation.
Well, law isn't always about judging people, right? Because, okay, even if you judge people, the standard can always change. Because how you judge people and how you think is right always changes. Mr. Speaker, we think we already engaged with fully. Now let me move on to my second question, which is about freedom of speech. Because, Mr. Speaker, they've always talked about how freedom of speech is so absolute. But we've told you it's not always that case. We think there's no such thing as value. We think it's always about balance. However, Mr. Speaker, we are now going to tell you about how the status quo is already doing a good job of promoting freedom of speech, about how you want to criticize the government, or how you want to actually criticize a multi-powered corporation that is abusing its power. That is already being done in the status quo. How are they being done? How media is actually fulfilling its role of being actually a watchdog and actually causing accusations. But we think, like, people who actually manipulate the evidence and actually manipulate the interviewing process, we think that's when the media and the public is actually failing to do its role. When you actually put in more malicious intents and actually put on more unnecessary mockery